Hi everyone. I'm so excited to see you all and to see you on this important day when we're going to be discussing a really exciting topic about the next generation of climate leaders. Today I'm joined by Meredith. Hi Meredith.
Hi, how are you?
I'm really great. I'm super excited to see you after we've been chasing each other across the globe and online for a year since COP26. I hope today we're going to be able to shed some light on all the amazing things that you do. But first and foremost, welcome, and it'll be wonderful to maybe hear just a few words of you introducing yourself.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me. So, I'm Meredith Adler. I'm the Executive Director of Student Energy Global. So, we're an organization that works with about 50,000 youth from 120 different countries on creating the next generation of energy leaders who will accelerate our sustainable energy transition. So, my real expertise and our expertise is in youth skill and capacity building. So, how do we bring more young people into the fold and give them the tools that they need to act on climate through energy? And also, we work a lot with governments, companies, and organizations on what does meaningful youth engagement look like, and how do you actually pursue intergenerational collaboration to really solve some of our biggest challenges.
How did this really kick off? Because you have now been for 7 years the executive director of this organization, and this is quite of a big topic that probably, if I remind myself of my own kickoff of Plan A, was not necessarily the most popular one 7 years ago. What happened since then, and how did this actually kick off as a project?
Yeah, so student energy actually started back in 2009 in Calgary, Alberta, which is the heart of the Canadian oil and gas industry, actually, and started there with a group of students who were really wanting to talk about climate change, wanting to talk about sustainability, but really at that time, nobody who was around them were really willing to do that. They were going to conferences, kind of getting a seat at the kids' table. There was really no space for that. And so they started their own conference, actually, our International Student Energy Summit, just to have space for young people to unite and talk about this. And so that first conference brought together youth from around the world and really was supposed to be a one-off, but it was such a magical moment of young people really connecting with energy leaders and each other, that student energy turned into another conference. And then after that, we really realized that there were so many opportunities for young people, but so little of the education system was really meeting the mark on helping them get there. And so student energy has grown and evolved really based on what are the needs that young people have, what are they asking for, and where are we the right people to kind of fill in that gap. And so yeah, when I started with the organization 7 years ago as the only staff person, and now we've grown to about 50 people. And so there's a lot since then, but I would say the first 3 or 4 years were really rough, basically trying to talk to people about why young people are so important. And then in the last couple of years, things have really taken off as people have started to recognize that like these are their employees, these are their consumers, these are their voters. Like you have to start paying attention to what it is they want and helping them be part of how we make these decisions that map out their future.
What really is exciting when you think about youth and about this project is that you're connecting the ideas of people that really feel deeply concerned for the future because this is the only one that they would have when they're going to be at the prime of their careers. They're going to be at the prime of their kind of lives where they would have also the possibility to make decisions for their lives, for their families. Um, how has the conversation shifted over the last few years? I'm sure that the momentum that was pre-COVID and then after COVID probably has shifted the opinions. Also, we have at the moment, unfortunately, a war that is leading also to an energy crisis. What is in your mind the has been the pivotal moment for this discussion to really become so prominent and for you to spin off from one conference, kind of another initiative, and build now an organization with participants from 120 countries?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting what has shifted and what has stayed the same. I think what has stayed the same is that young people really want a lot of transparency and they want to know the whole story. They want to know why the energy system is the way it is. They want to know like what we can do to change it. So a lot of that has actually really stayed the same over the last 12 years, to be honest. But I think what's interesting now is that, with the awareness of climate change young people are really the driver of the momentum behind the conversation at this point. And I think we see that with the big climate protests that have happened. And so now, young people are really coming into their own in terms of what kind of a force they can be. But unfortunately, where we're at is that the energy system has been shaped in such a complex way that it's not so easy to just walk into you know any like an oil and gas company and change it, or it's not so easy to just start a solar company. And so I think what we're seeing more and more is young people really wanting those tools to accelerate their transition. And I think where we're also seeing is that the traditional education system is not shifting fast enough, is is not meeting the needs of young people like it used to. It used to be that you went to school, you studied a certain type of engineering, you could get into the energy industry. It's a very clear path. And the energy industry at the time was really working hand in hand with universities to get people there. Now what we're seeing is in sustainability, you need such a varied skill set that really what you need is more practical skills application, the opportunity to do and deploy your own projects. And so is what student energy is really focused on, is getting people these hands-on skills that accelerate their path, because we only really have until 2030 to start to set these things up, and that includes the skill set of young people who are going to deliver on all of our sustainability goals.
Absolutely, and I think it's really interesting you mentioned that there's been historically an engagement between industry and the educational sector to enable this transition to happen and for people to find jobs and excitement to be part of a certain industry, certain job opportunity. And today, this is not the case. Why do you think that is? Do you think sustainability is overwhelmingly big and renewable is way too novel, so it has not translated itself yet into frameworks and kind of educational courses? What do you think is causing this?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think initially, climate scientists and climate activists were working so hard for governments to recognize them, for industry to recognize them, that so much of the skill set was really in this layer of doing research and then advocating for that research to be heard. And I think it was a really sudden shift. I apologize for the noise. It was a really sudden shift between that. And I apologize, I think I need to move rooms quickly here. But it was a really crazy shift between, all of a sudden the world is waking up to this. ESG is a big deal. People are making money off of this. But now where is that skill set? And I think it really takes that historical knowledge. And that is one of the biggest shifts we're seeing.
Yeah, maybe I can take the moment while you maybe go and find a better place for the discussion. Yeah, I just switch off for a second. So, for those of you that maybe are hearing about this organization for the first time, I can give a bit of context. So, as Meredith was saying, it's a global youth organization empowering the next generation of leaders to accelerate the transition to sustainable energy. And what they've built is a network of 50,000 young people from 120 countries. And they work on 6 building blocks, 6 pillars that support this community really to be able to build really this just transition. The first one is related to an intergenerational and global equity. The second is related to the cultural shifts that are related to energy. The third one is related to collaboration and cooperation. Then mobilize finance, policy frameworks, and technologies developed and implemented. So I gave a bit of an overview of the pillars that are the building blocks of your organization. Can you walk us through maybe each one of them just with a few sentences of what does it mean technologies developed and implemented? What does it mean also the cultural shifts, and how did you come up with these building blocks as the kind of framework behind the activities that you have?
Definitely. So really, our theory of change and our building blocks are actually built off of a lot of the successes that we saw from young people going out of that very first conference, or the first few conferences, and where they were able to make change quickly in the world. And so what we really see our role as is actually giving people that broader systems thinking skill set so that they can go into mobilizing those pieces. So I mean, what we know we need in terms of addressing climate change is new and different technologies within energy. And we think that young people are actually really well positioned to figure out what a lot of those are, especially at a community level. A lot of what we're seeing now is not necessarily a challenge with what technology is out there, but more challenges with business model innovation and the ability to deploy technologies. And that's where young people often come in, is they're really good at looking at their community around them and saying, oh, this is a need, these are an opportunities, and here's where we go. And so one example, we have an alumni, now board member, Brian Kakembo, who's based in Kampala, Uganda, and he came to one of our conferences and learned a lot about waste to energy, clean cooking, and actually went home and worked with his engineering department to develop a clean burning briquette based on street trash that is there in Kampala. And so now he has 200 youth who work for him building these briquettes, and lots of customers who now have a cleaner burning briquette to use, which is a big challenge in Uganda. And so those are the types of things we see a lot. And that's a lot of what we're talking about with technology. Some of it is still novel technologies being built in the lab, but really, what our focus is on right now is like, how do we get to more deployment? We have so many things that are available that are not deployed at scale. And we see young people as really the linchpin for that. And then I think within that, we also see cultural shifts as a big need. There's often this debate on, is it, 100 companies that are causing all of our problems and they just need to be regulated? Or is it that we all need to take individual action and think about our diets and our personal carbon footprint? And really what we're going for is it's not an either or situation. We want young people to feel empowered. And when you're thinking about cultural shifts, young people are such an important piece of that, because once you turn 50 or 60, it seems like, a lot of people really shut off to new ideas of how to do things. And I can't tell you how many people have come up to me, even at climate conferences, and said, oh, yeah, I bought an EV because my kid wouldn't stop bugging me about it. Or I started composting because my kid wouldn't stop bugging me about it. So they really are really great influencers, both of their parents and their families and their communities. And so that's why we see it as such a big tool. And I think the big picture that most companies are missing, especially, but also governments, is that engaging young people is how you play the long game. If you want somebody to do something for the rest of their life, having a positive experience with it before you turn 25 is pretty essential. And people will stick with brands that they like before they're 25. They'll stick with like theories that they have, political parties, all kinds of things. And so really thinking about, okay, how do we teach them that skill set to mobilize sustainability early and be part of our company's objectives, our government's objectives to make this all happen, is really great bang for your buck in terms of having long-term change.
I fully agree with you, because we in Plan A are working on the other spectrum of the story, where we support businesses on decarbonization and policy tracking and reporting. And quite often we end up seeing a company that has no sustainability or ESG team to kick off an initiative because an employee acts as a green champion and really pushes the topic to a level where there's resources that get to be enabled, there's time, there's also even sometimes a full-fledged team that on a volunteering basis works for that. I want to double down on the details related to skill sets, particularly related to this. You did mention that young people have the capacity to build technologies that are relevant to climate, relevant to energy transition. We often get phone calls from people saying, I want to work for you, but I don't have sustainability background. Is this possible? And always the answer is yes, of course, because, a good salesperson is a good salesperson, a good developer is a good developer. When it comes to energy, where have you seen at the moment the biggest skill gaps? And who is taking actually charge of filling in these gaps, making sure that there's a lot of opportunity for people, regardless of where they're based, to go through this learning and then become active participants in this transition?
Yeah, so I think the biggest skill gap we see is that a lot of people in energy now want kind of a Swiss Army knife of a person, is what it's described as. So somebody who can think about the big picture of how do you, get the permits for the project, fund it, get the stakeholders engaged, secure the technology, all of those types of things. And I think the issue is a lot of the traditional energy industry is very siloed. It's really department by department. There isn't a lot of cross cutting work. And so the people who are able to come in and kind of see the bigger picture are really the skill set that's missing right now. And so that's why in our programs, we really do focus quite a bit on educational experiences that focus on project deployment, because within that you're learning a lot of basically your core soft skills around communication, around building your team, around stakeholder development, policies, and then also understanding the technology. And so that is one of the biggest things that we see. I think when you look at what's happening globally as well, there are actually very few, I think, master's programs or other things that are really teaching this systems level knowledge. And so most of where people are getting that is once again through project deployment. I think that the biggest kind of technical skill gap is really in how do you get a project off the ground. It's not necessary. There are lots of people who know how to install solar panels at this point, tons of things like that, but are those people in the right places? And then are they able to put those pieces together? And finally, what I would also highlight is I think there's a lot of misunderstandings on an intergenerational level as to what's needed and what will drive behavior change. And that's where we advocate a lot more for intergenerational collaboration, because the people who are running a lot of the larger companies have a very different reality than the people that are their customers. And so there is a need to kind of to bridge the gap really on what that looks like, because our generation is living in a very different world than their predecessors were, and getting a job, having a house, all those things are not the same at all.
Absolutely, yeah. Do you think there's a geographical difference in terms of the skill distribution and who manages projects well or not so well?
Absolutely. I think you see it all the time. There are so many super talented people in Africa, Asia, Latin America, all over the place, but they have fewer master's programs and fewer opportunities often to get into this work, because so many of the larger companies are headquartered in North America and in Europe. And so I see that as a big challenge that Student Energy is even working to address, is how do you get more local.
I think we lost you for a second on the maybe you're mute.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's
Am I
okay.
back?
It was
Sorry
just
about that.
the last few sentences. So good.
Technical challenges moment. So we're seeing a lot of so basically what I was saying is there are young people all around the world who are really excited about this, but ultimately there are more opportunities to get into sustainability work, paid work in North America and in Europe. And
Mhm.
so and that's a really big problem in terms of the gap, because the young people elsewhere are just as talented and just as driven. And these are also the places where we need more deployment of renewable energy technologies. We need sustainable cooling for all. We need more clean cooking. And so it is one thing that Student Energy is really working on. We actually have entrepreneurship programs. We also have a guided projects program where we're really helping people to get to deployment and working to raise money actually to start to be their first grant funder, because it's such a missed opportunity at this point not to be empowering young people to take
Mhm.
hold of that in their countries. And it is a concern also that you would end up with too much brain drain. You would end up with too many folks going to Europe, going to North America, instead of staying home and doing what they can do to really lift up and serve their own communities.
It's really exciting to hear about some of the activities and initiatives that you have. Maybe can you give us an overview of the projects that you're working on? What are the outputs of the organization and how can people get involved? We have a bunch of questions in the chat, and I encourage everyone to add their own questions where people are asking, how do you get partners?
Definitely. So we have a whole range of how to get involved. So and it starts really with our international summits, and our chapter program are really all about community building and letting youth have the opportunity to take hold of smaller projects in their community and really get their foot in the door. So I think we're one of the few organizations that's really focused on very entry level. So you don't need to know anything about energy, you don't need to know anything about sustainability. You just need to be eager, and you can apply to join us. And so that's one big opportunity. We also have a fellowship program that takes people through their first project. So it's a 10-month program. It starts every January. And so applications will be open this fall. And then finally, we do a career training program, which mimics your very first internship. And so it helps feed folks into their first job. And then our guided projects and student energy entrepreneurs programs are really all about project deployment and helping people to really craft the skill set that they need to start their own company, be that in solar energy efficiency or in something that they've invented themselves. And so that is a big part of what we do. So those are all the pieces that we do to serve youth. And then we do work a lot with governments and corporations around youth engagement. So we'll run youth advisory councils that help advise leadership teams. We also do a lot of reports. So we have the Global Youth Energy Outlook series, which has mapped out what it is young people want from the energy future, as well as what gaps exist for them. So that's a lot of the data we have, and we're working on a green jobs companion piece this summer actually for COP27.
Wow, you have a busy agenda, I can confirm. Quite an
Absolutely.
exciting one. One thing that came out in a conversation last week with an activist, climate activist, a young girl, she was saying, "Oh, your job is probably so much more satisfying because you see the actual results of changing companies, whereas what we push for is systemic change that is so big that sometimes it gets really difficult to see the end of the whole story." Have you felt like this within the energy industry, or have you heard people voice such concerns with their engagements and how they felt maybe it was as if you're shouting in a desert, there's not much of a response, it's such a big topic that you never feel satisfied with the results?
That's a really good question. I would say in the earlier years, I did really feel like we were shouting into the void in a lot of ways. Um, but now, I guess one benefit of longevity in being an older youth-led organization, and also myself now being older, is you actually do start to see where you said something and then things changed, but you have to really kind of pay attention. And I think that's often the harder part for youth activists. But there have actually been plenty of times now where 3 years ago we did a research project for someone, and then ultimately it ended up in them changing a lot of their different policies and operations in a company or in a government. But that changes a lot slower than you want it to be. And so I think this is actually the big difference really between young people and those who are in power right now is thinking about timescale and how people think about timescale. Young people are very impatient to have this change happen, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that people can call young people naive about it, but really, I think they actually just understand the urgency a bit better. And then, whereas other people are used to bureaucracy, they're used to things taking a long time, they're used to projects taking 5 or 10 years to get off the ground. And so I think that there is probably a happier medium there, but this is where we don't see change often. But in the last 7 years, it is actually phenomenal the way in which so many people have actually taken up the call of engaging young people and being better partners. And it is honestly much easier to do the work now than it was 7 years ago, and I think that's great. And I hope that when I move on from student energy, or when the next youth org starting up as well, it should be easier and easier for them to do the work as well, because that is how we move faster. And so as much as there's a lot of actors that need to change and are being too stubborn, there's also a good amount of people who have really done the work and thought hard about how can we move faster, how can we listen to more young people. And I think that those champions are really essential in the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really exciting to hear also a positive comment from you in terms of what you've been seeing in your work. And what is the setup that you have when it comes to partners? I think we've gotten now a bunch of questions of how do people partner with you? What is the ways in which people can engage? And organizations, of course.
Definitely. So we have all different types of partners. We do partner with a lot of youth organizations around the world and try to work on having kind of cohesive toolkits as well as messaging. And so that's often a strategic partnership, and you would honestly just reach out to myself or some of our staff who are on that team. And But we really value strongly our youth partners in this space because it's really important, I think, to have young people who are working in all different sectors and geographies. If for folks who want to join our programs, all of that is available on our website, studentenergy.org. There's tons of different applications, but watching that in our social media channels is an easy way to partner with us. And then companies and organizations who are interested in partnering, we are sometimes a little bit selective. We want to be really careful as to who we're working with, but those who are really willing to commit to youth engagement principles, once again, reach more out to me or to our partnerships team. And we're all available on LinkedIn. But anybody who's really sincerely interested in crafting a meaningful youth engagement strategy is someone that we're really interested in working with as well. But I guess partnering with us does come with some rules. We are very defensive of our youth network, and that's an important thing for us too.
Yeah, it's an important comment you're making, because I think we need to stay aligned with our values in order to be able to deliver on the larger vision that we have. I would encourage anyone listening on YouTube and on LinkedIn to put their comments in the chat. We're getting all of them, and I'm going to start taking some of them. So we have a question that is particularly related to skills, and that is how green skills can be imparted in the youth entrepreneurs who have already achieved some results but have not been able to access the market due to certain inhibitions of regional and national policies. In other words, how governments involve, and I'm just going to continue reading because it's a bit of a longer one, how government involvement in validating new clean technology is required if the results are drastically positive without their involvement. Really interesting question. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Definitely, and I'm just reading it myself as well. So the inhibitions of government are an interesting one. I think that there are many ways in which government plays a lot of roles, and actually our research has shown that the number one thing that youth are asking for is really strong government leadership on climate. And so they really want to see government setting the rules of the road and companies and others kind of falling in line to be supportive of that. And I think that this can be a little bit different than how we see things. I mean, even with, even as the Paris Agreement launched, a big credit of that was to the corporate sector rallying around it. And we see a lot of other initiatives around that. And so in terms of government, and then I think governments are often really risk-averse actors. And so you hear this a lot, that governments don't want to, be responsible for picking a winner, or be responsible for this, or be responsible for that. And I think what we're seeing from young people is they want governments to take on that responsibility. They want them to try, and they want them to kind of put themselves out there and see what happens. And it really, none of this will happen without government. Permitting processes are a huge issue within the energy industry. And that seems so boring and minute, but really, if you can't get a permit to do something, it's not going to work. I think also, and then also funding is often really contingent on government. And even for governments that don't necessarily have the funding of like Europe and North America, you still need to be working with different actors to cultivate those funding landscapes. And so, all that to be said is government has a huge role to play. But I think this is also where young people come in, is young people also have a huge role to play in uniting and really being clear in their demands from their governments, and voting and organizing in that way, because ultimately, governments are elected by people for the most part. And that is a really important thing to remember, is that, people power is a big part of how all of this happens. And it can't just be one actor that we're looking at to place the blame either. But it is much harder to have to hold people to account all the time. But hopefully, as this generation grows up, that becomes easier and easier as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's really exciting to think that now there's just so much engagement from different stakeholders, that for the places where government is not as involved, there's other stakeholders that compensate. For the places where government is really involved, there's maybe a lot more opportunity for collaboration. But somehow people, and especially the youth, always find their way into the topic, and be it through activism, be it through engagement of their family or the stakeholders that they're educating about the issues. Um, we have a question that is related to the educational component of your work, and that is essentially, how do students learn and become aware of these energy focused activities? I think this is a really interesting question because probably you have so many people that come and they've developed already the passion, but what happens on the step before where this passion maybe was not yet unraveled?
Yeah, so what we see often is that the earlier intervention, the better. There's so many people who are, CEOs of major international environmental organizations right now who started their journey because their second grade teacher was really into the environment. And so and you can draw lots and lots of those lines. Um, and and so one thing that we don't actually do ourselves as student energy, but really think is very important is elementary and high school education on environment and starting really early, talking to young people about that and about why it matters. And then I think, how else do people get involved? So we actually have a whole energy systems map that explains the energy system and climate change online with YouTube videos. And that has over 14 million users. And that is one thing that we see all the time is that the more accessible the energy education is, the more people use it. And even for our own programs, I mean, often we're not really even in a position of recruiting or marketing that much because there's so much intake. But what we do see a lot of is so many young people actually join us because they want other young people in their community to know and understand more, and they want the tools to do that. And so I think the most effective way to bring people in is actually peer-to-peer engagement. There's a lot of talk about social media and how that influences people, and it does. But ultimately, the biggest influencer are your friends around you who are talking to you about these topics. And so, how do we make it easier for young people to talk and to get more people engaged? And then I think in terms of educational resources, a big misunderstanding in the world is how much climate change education there is out there. A lot of young people are talking about climate change, but there are very few curriculums globally that integrate climate change at a high school level and even at a university level. You can go through most university degrees without learning a single thing about climate change. And so that is something that we want to change at a base level. People should really understand where we're coming from. But then I think the thing that really brings more people into the fold than anything else is once they realize the human impacts, and once they realize that this is an impact, climate and energy impacts your healthcare, it impacts your education, it impacts your ability to have children. All of those different things are some of the biggest drivers for people to really get involved and stay involved. And so, that's something that we try to draw to as well, is how human this challenge is. This isn't just about the polar bears. This is about all of us and all of our survival on the planet.
Absolutely, yeah. It's so important to put it into context. And what we always say is that climate change needs to be normalized because it's still somehow discussed as a phenomena that is patched up to the reality that we have. But the truth is that it's actually a lot bigger of an issue. So moving on to maybe a discussion about the way actually the generation that you work with thinks. There's a lot of research that shows that Gen Z cares a lot more about sustainable buying, and in terms of decision making, they would go for this kind of choice. And they're a lot more outspoken about kind of sustainability, climate change. In the way our economy works, people at that stage of their career or progress are not necessarily involved in any decision making. Their participation, although clearly, is crucial for systemic change. Do you think that we're missing an opportunity by not engaging youth in decision making? I don't necessarily mean voting. I don't want to get political because I'm sure people have opinions about this, but more, how do you see youth engaging also with these stakeholders that maybe are the ones that distribute the budgets and kick off the projects and are the businesses that implement the change? Do you feel like they get enough visibility?
Yeah, I feel like they don't get enough visibility. And I actually think that the side note to that is sometimes people will try to integrate youth into decision making, but actually it's often poorly executed, which is another shame, is that this space opens up, but there's no recognition of the fact that there's a serious power imbalance or there's a lot of information asymmetry. And so they'll plop one 18-year-old into a room of CEOs and expect them, and the 18-year-old will suggest that they all go net zero or what have you. And then the CEOs will be like, oh, that's ridiculous because they don't realize this, that, and the other thing. Whereas obviously these people have 40, 50 years of experience that they're building off of to make that assumption. And so what we really advocate for within our youth advisory council model, and what we see work best elsewhere, is when you're really preparing young people for that experience. So it's not that their opinion isn't valid, but it's that you need to level the playing field. So a lot of what we actually do is training ahead of time to make sure that there isn't this information asymmetry, that people are on the same playing field in terms of what we're talking about. So that is often a lot of work with the youth one-on-one as to how do you feel comfortable in these conversations? What is the background for this topic that we're going to be talking about? And then I think when you prepare them that way, you see much, much better results. And then, when it comes to budget conversations, when it comes to policy conversations, and this could be at a company, not just necessarily a government, young people are really able to kind of see things a bit differently in a really positive aspect and be very collaborative. I think that's the other big misconception, is often people just see Gen Z as like this group of complainers who don't know what they're talking about, which is terrible. And I think really what's going on is that, they need the information to be able to have those accurate conversations. And then once they have it, they are really good at just sitting there and saying like, hey, why is that thing the way it is? Because there are lots of things that we've made assumptions about. I even noticed this in myself as I get older. You just get set in your ways, and you do need those new voices to come in and say like, wait, why have we been doing it that way? And sometimes that is all it takes to really, really pivot things in a more positive direction. And I do believe that we should really be getting to more of a shared decision-making piece. And you even see this actually in marketing. There was a really great case study around, I can't remember exactly which ones, but two luxury brands, one of which kind of enabled a youth advisory council, and their sales really took off compared to their competitor, who was just listening to only their C-suite, whereas the one who would really enable their young staff to be part of their decision making, was quick to social media campaigns, quick to influencer campaigns, all kinds of things that we know sell luxury goods really well. And I think it's a great example of how, if you are running a company today, how are you talking to your young staff even, and what are they seeing, and we have this all the time in student energy. Even, I don't necessarily coach our chapters anymore, but I try to talk to our people who do, because they're the ones who are getting that firsthand information on essentially what our customers need, and really coming up with the more inventive ideas on how do we be a more effective organization. And I think everybody really could be doing this in many ways, but especially on sustainability, because this generation has grown up with so much more information and so many different ways of seeing things than their leadership. But their leadership has a lot of wisdom to share that we need really to be able to actually make those solutions move.
Yeah, this is a fantastic way of transitioning to the next question, which is focused on, do we need more people from the industry to go back into teaching so that we fill in the gap? I understand this question in a way that you mentioned there's very little formal education on sustainability. Can we do something about it by using all the knowledge that is out there, and moving people that are in industry, I don't know, on a part-time basis to focus their efforts on the sustainable transformation and knowledge?
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question, and I would highly advocate for this. I think, one of the most effective energy education programs that I know about is actually at Western Washington University. And the reason that it works so well is almost all of the faculty has worked in industry, and they really know what they're talking about, and they know these systems, and they know these hangups. There are, unfortunately, the way the university system is set up is a lot of it is there to incentivize research, incentivize publications. Teaching is an afterthought for most universities. And that's really a shame, because, these young minds do want to learn a lot. Not everybody needs a PhD in order to make a big impact. But I think if we did have more people from industry going in and teaching, we could really be like making things happen faster. An alternative, if you don't want to quit your day job, but you still want to contribute, is that, every company should really be thinking about what is their pipeline for sustainability talent. There's a huge dearth of sustainability talent right now. Anybody who works in ESG knows that, people are getting poached and headhunted all the time. It's hard to keep staff. I hear about this constantly. And part of that reason is there's not enough people who are doing really great intern programs, who are really working on cultivating their next generation. And so, any company and every company should really be thinking about how are we taking in these, bright-eyed young people who just really want to make a difference and helping them to grow and have a meaningful role and have the coaching and mentorship they need, because a lot of this is always going to be on the job training, and you need to make sure that your company is prepared to be doing its part and to also to be, cultivating its own champions who are willing to help it be, the best company it can be.
Amazing. We have a question that is related to financing. I'm sure you have some thoughts on how projects around energy and sustainability can be financed. So the question that we have at hand is, what are your thoughts on crowdfunding through social media, influencing activities? Can networks like yours be able to engage influencers to generate funding for clean tech, showing positive results towards net zero targets?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, funding is the biggest challenge in the youth world. And I can even say that from my own experience. Most philanthropic organizations are incredibly hesitant to fund youth charities. Most governments are hesitant to fund youth. And so it is a really challenging space to be in because so much of funding is based on track record. I think that crowdfunding is great. It is a good way to go. But I actually also firmly believe that, every government that has an innovation fund, every company that has an innovation fund, every philanthropic group, you need to be setting aside 10, 20, 30% of what you're doing to be funding kind of youth-led work and that early stage work, because really it is your first $10,000, $20,000 that are the hard part. And then once you prove that you can do a good job with that, people are willing to keep investing with you. And I mean, it is something that Student Energy is currently working on. We have a solutions movement campaign where we want to mobilize $150 million for youth-led projects, because we see so many gaps, especially outside of Europe and North America. We see, huge amounts of talent that just can't get funded, and we want to start being a conduit to bridge that gap. So I think, anywhere and everywhere you can get it, funding is great and it is necessary. But I think also those who do have resources and means really need to critically think about how are they mobilizing that to people who don't need as much as they don't need the funding of a carbon capture storage project. They need $10,000, but often that's way harder to get. And that lack of funding and that lack of opportunity to practice having funding and budgeting and doing all of that is really holding back a whole generation of entrepreneurs. And so that's something we need to be really cognizant of.
So, as we're coming to an end of our session, I have obviously a positive question about what are you most hopeful for when it comes to the future of the energy system and this transition that you're leading for the youth, but obviously as a trickle-down effect for a whole generation that comes also around them, not only within their groups.
Yeah, it's a little bit cheesy, but I mean, the youth are what is giving me a lot of hope and for what's going to happen next. I think there are so many young people who are super driven, and then you're also seeing them really think critically about their own lifestyles. Is it what is worth my time? Is it like, can I make different choices so that I don't need to consume as many goods or eat as much meat, all of those different types of things. And so in so many ways, young people are inspiring. And I think one thing that we see all the time at Student Energy is people are often doing kind of a grain of information. They listen to one webinar, they go to one speaker, they get one training session, and then all of a sudden that has turned into this giant initiative that we didn't even know that they were pursuing. And so I think that's another piece that gives me a lot of hope is this multiplier effect of how young people really are latching on to the tools that they can get and making the most of them, and really working to drive that forward. And I actually do believe that there's lots and lots of reasons to be hopeful about our climate future, as people are starting to coalesce around where we need to go and digging deep into how we figure out those solutions.
And then, as a final question on my side, I would love to hear your thoughts on some practical tips for individuals on how they can change their impact on energy. Is there anything that you've adapted in your life that has really fundamentally changed the level of CO2 emissions that you have associated to energy, or at least has pushed you into being a really better advocate for this topic also in your day to day?
Definitely. So I think as an individual, there's many layers of what you can do. One is if you live in North America, maybe not Europe, advocating for walkable communities with a lot of transit is huge. If you need a car on your day to day to get to the grocery store, etc., that is a huge carbon impact that doesn't have to be happening. But it takes a lot to transform things if you don't currently work in a walkable community. And so I think that's a really, really big one, is thinking about your own personal modes of transportation. Um, Also, talking to people about energy and about energy choices is essential. A lot of people don't like to talk about it, but the more you're talking about it, the more you're talking about advocating for this change, um, you know, the more comfortable people will feel. And just like my example with electric vehicles and kids, like, people, these are new things. People are going to feel scared. They will feel less scared if their friends and family are talking about it. And then also advocating for it to be simpler to make changes. I think, I saw a Twitter thread yesterday about how hard it is to get a heat pump installed in your house instead of having a natural gas furnace. Like, it can't continue to be this hard. So if you're in a financial position to break ground, do it. But then also try to think about how do we make this easier for other people to make those choices. And finally, doing your bit wherever you are in the company that you work in, with the government you can vote for, any of those types of pieces. It's important to kind of really think critically about, okay, where are we consuming a lot of CO2, and is there a way to change that, or are there people I can engage to help me make those decisions better?
Yeah, this is really useful, and I'm so grateful that you took the time to speak to us today. Thank you. And do you have maybe some final thoughts or something you want to share? If there's any announcements, or where can people find you?
Oh yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of your work, and I'm glad that we finally connected this way. Yeah, and so people can find our work at studentenergy.org, also on Instagram, on Twitter, at Student Energy, Facebook as well. And then coming up, I think we'll be recruiting for our career training program for the fall, and our fellowship as well. So look out for that, and as well as our chapter network. And then into COP27, we'll be releasing a lot of different toolkits actually around working with youth and understanding what young people want. So if you are a decision maker who's looking for that information, do follow along, because that'll be coming out in October.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here, Meredith. I would say bye, and I'm just gonna share some final news with the group here. We have two events coming up in August. We're using the fact that people are actually taking some time off to also fill their minds and souls with some good ideas on how they can work on something related to sustainability. The first guest that we're going to have is the head of sustainability of Vodafone Germany, Therese Zaringen. She will tell us a bit more about how they're transitioning and moving essentially one of the biggest telecom companies into a sustainable mode. They have incredible initiatives, so they'll share very practical advices on that. And then we're going to be chatting to Dr. Aditi from Systemic, who is going to tell us on how to decarbonize the food systems. Thank you so much, Meredith, again. And for those of you wanting to engage with the next events, check them out in the chat that is also going to include some links to the upcoming events. See you soon.
Thank you so much.